I'm Margaret Pizzola-Granlund. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction here, and then we will get into the artist talk. I want to welcome everyone. This is part of the public programming for our exhibition Thread, which features 3 artists who think about and make work about history. The 3 artists are Maria Demlau, who's a Philadelphia-based artist, Jim Denemy, an artist from Minnesota, and joining us today, Jessica Wimbley, who is based in Sacramento, California. We're so excited to have Jessica talk about her work today. I know many of you have had a chance to see her work in the gallery, and I have to say I've been really pleased with the exhibition and the responses to the exhibition. And I've really seen a lot of people looking at your work, Jessica, so it's been so terrific to have it in the gallery. Awesome. Jessica Wimbley received her BFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design and an M.F.A. in visual arts from the University of California, Davis. She also has a master's degree in arts management from the Claremont Graduate University, and she's been included in dozens of group shows across the country and received critical reviews in Hyperallergic, Art and Cake, LA Weekly, Huffington Post, and the LA Times. Wimbley's public art projects include the Social Justice Billboard project in collaboration with the Northeast Sculpture and Gallery Factory in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her billboard Masking Testament was installed near the corner of 38th and Chicago, the site of the George Floyd murder, and the recently completed Masking Series 2021, featuring video and still photography created in partnership with the state of California and the Center at Sierra Health Foundation to speak directly to Californians who have been hardest hit by COVID-19. Additionally, as part of the City of Sacramento's Your Actions Save Lives public art campaign, Wimbley's large-scale video work, Masking, is located in Sacramento's Arden Fair Mall and in Oak Park, Sacramento neighborhood. Masking has been featured in the Sacramento Bee, on ABC News and KCRA, with an ad campaign in 11 markets statewide, which include print media, digital billboards, and a TV spot. So today, Jessica is going to talk to us about her practice, the sources for her work, and kind of how she goes about making some of the work that we see in the gallery. And Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Oh, I should note that you can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will be looking at those. I'll kind of keep an eye on it as we go along, but please ask any questions. We'll definitely get to them. I'll turn it over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Hello, everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I wanted to start off by talking about different influences in my work, and they're not just regulated to the visual arts, but you have thinkers across the humanities, across the sciences that interest me and influence how I make work, why I make work. And one of the people that has been a great influence has been Audre Lorde, who is a poet and activist. And I was really inspired by her book, Biomythography, or her book, Zam, the New Spelling of My Name, in which she introduces the term biomythography. And from a literary point of view, she thinks of it as a literary form that blends elements of the autobiography, the novel, and personal mythology. And I love the different blends of elements that she's bringing to her narrative practice. And I liked thinking about, how does biomythography work within the visual arts? How can I engage in biomythography in the creation of my work? I'm also thinking about different ideas that involve such thoughts such as intersectionality, which is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, to describe overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. And thinking about the biomythography in relationship to intersectionality, I thought was a really interesting frameworks that overlap in terms of articulating the complexity of our lived identities that are multifaceted. Next, you have a writer by Michelle M. Wright. And she's somebody who teaches in African-American studies and about the diaspora. And she's known for the book Becoming Black and the Physics of Blackness. And the Physics of Blackness was really interesting because she proposes a methodology that examines racial categories like Blackness, not as a what, but as a when and a where. So this idea of it being both a construct and a moment of interpretation, I thought was really interesting way to think about identity, especially the idea of how identities can shift. So Wright is asking, what does it mean to be Black? If Blackness is not biological in origin, but socially and discursively constructed, does the meaning of Blackness change over time and space? And so those questions in terms of thinking about Blackness, I thought was something that was really interesting in terms of looking at how you tell the story of identity. And with that, I'm also interested in ideas within Afrofuturism, which is a philosophy and history that explores the developing intersection of the African diaspora culture with technology. So where does that leave me in terms of these different influences about storytelling? And I always start off with my parents, and on the left, you have a picture of my mom and dad, and my parents are super iconic to me. I think they're totally beautiful people. And this picture always reminded me of Princess Leia and Shaft. And it's this idea of relating also where you're seeing like representations, or where are you starting to pull different representations that you're seeing in popular culture or in media culture to help form identity. I think this is even made more prominent within growing up because my parents owned an advertising agency. And so a lot of the work that they did was producing commercials and imagery that targeted BIPOC audiences. And many of these images and these advertisings could be found in publications made by Johnson publications such as Ebony or Jet. And these publications are really interesting in that they capture African-American life and culture from the late 1940s onward, so that you have this real kind of cultural archive that's been produced through this publication of African-American history, culture, etc., and how these representations and consumption of these images kind of impact how you would tell, reflect history or develop your sense of identity. So looking at these different mediums has been something that's interesting in the sense that not only were my parents producing content to go within it, my father actually ended up being in it after he passed away. So you have this really interesting tension between both creating the imagery and becoming the imagery that I always found an interesting tension in terms of my family having a business working in advertising, being Black and creating these different kind of representations of Blackness, and then consuming that and how that kind of informed my own sense of self and identity. In this image here, you're seeing a picture of my mom. And my mom is also someone who is interested in telling her story and does family genealogy and looks at family history. And she contributed to this book, Kinder der Bevölkerung, and it's about Afro-Deutsche kids after World War II and their experience growing up in their lives, et cetera, and their family stories. So my mom was able to write her parents' kind of story, and it's included in this book. So this idea of her creating this narrative and telling this narrative is something that is really of interest to me, something that's very typical of like a mother doing genealogy and passing down this information across different generations. But that familial story doesn't just end in the textual form or even in the verbal telling or the oral tradition. But now with technology, we have the ability to tell interesting genetic stories through DNA tests, et cetera. And so here you're seeing two different DNA tests, one I did with National Geographic, one I did with 23andMe. And here, this is a look at kind of our family origin or where people have traveled throughout the world and kind of spreading out across the world. This is more specifically where my family line comes from. And I always laugh because it's like a big question mark out of Africa, the shape of it. But it shows the migration out of Africa through Central Asia, Europe, and the Mediterranean. And then just the breakdown of the kind of racial makeup. And as you can see, there's total differences between the two. And the way that they gather information to give you information about your kind of genetic history is kind of another layer of identity, another layer of story. And it's at this kind of micro level. And so looking at storytelling at this micro level has also been something that I thought was interesting. And so I'll include microscopic images such as melanin in my work. And this image is actually called a melanin ghost. And for those of you who are not familiar, melanin is what determines your eye color, your skin color, your hair color. And finally, with narrative, I'm really interested and actually love Octavia Butler. If any of you are into science fiction and are looking for Black female centralized characters, then Octavia Butler is someone you should definitely get into. And one of the things that I found so inspiring, besides her books just being awesome, is the fact that she was just straight up like, I wrote myself in. I kept reading science fiction, noticed that I didn't see myself, and I knew I could write, so I'm gonna write my own story and include myself. I can write myself. So that agency and kind of representation and thinking about sci-fi and imagining Black females in the future is something that I love about her work, and again, is an influence in my own practice. Here is an image of synesthesia, and it relates to this idea again of Black physics, different ways of experiencing time and space. And synesthesia is when you, in this image in particular, is a representation of when you actually experience time through color. And so here, these colors kind of are the representation of the color scheme that if you have synesthesia, how you would experience and kind of perceive time through this particular lens, which I thought was an interesting way to incorporate a sense of time within my work. So getting to my artist statement, pulling all those ideas together, I use the literary term biomythography as an interdisciplinary visual arts practice. And I investigate and question identity and history I merged both the genetic and biological with the social historical, creating narratives that shift between micro and macro representations. And I use multiple approaches, including painting, drawing, collage, digital photography, and also video. And I actually create an inventory and build kind of an archive of different images that I can pull on, including stereographs, cabinet cards, found photos, family photos, and actually producing portraiture. And so it's great because many of you going to the exhibition and looking at Thread, you could see Maria's work in her discussion with the stereograph. And so here are images and representations of the stereograph, the dual images that have slight differences that end up creating this illusion of movement. This was early 3D that you looked through a viewfinder. And what I'm so stoked to be in Thread and to have my work included and in discussion with Maria's, because I love within the stereograph how you can have multiple stories being told simultaneously through the medium. I'm also looking at old photographs, old portraiture, and cabinet cards. And there's a great site called the Mirror of Race. And this is actually one of the images from their archive, but they have a bunch. And what this archive is really looking at is how racial identity was being formed in the late 1800s, mid-late 1800s, and shaping how Americans were forming notions of identity. And so I love this image in terms of how they incorporated the hair within the imagery as part of the portraiture, and especially what it could mean now in terms of being able to get genetic information from it, and there being yet another layer in story in shift in identity that happens. So here are some different representations of the works in the collection in the Mirror of Race. And you can see kind of different narratives happening in terms of assimilation. This is actually a courtesan that was often found in early photography known as the first Caucasian. So and we're often in circus and theater. So it's a really interesting figure and representation where you had old world versus new world politics happening at the time. And so a lot of places in the world were thought of as being old world, while America was taking on this notion of modernity. And doing that through the use of technology, as you can see here with photography, and having agency now in terms of how they're presenting themselves and how they're crafting their own identities, and photography being such a huge breakthrough in terms of helping people develop and shape and form their new identities. And to put it in perspective, when people had portraits done before, it was paintings, it was usually people who were wealthy and who were important. With the advent of the development of photography, but also of the cabinet card, something that was small that you could trade, all of a sudden, regular people can now be documented and seen as important, and so on. So talking about my work from the cabinet card series, again, thinking about it as a dominant form of portrait photography, I was really interested in the relationship between the cabinet card, its relationship to identity, the formation of identity, thinking about what is that in conversation with today? What does that look like in the lineage of identity formation? And so using collaging and pulling different identities from Ebony magazine, and playing with composition and portraiture, I started to create these new images that were taking on both late 1800s technology and technology printing processes from the 70s and incorporating them into a singular image. I also started ripping and tearing the works, having elements literally kind of coming through the work and being really aggressive with both of the materials. And here's another image of my mom, and also thinking about people that I know and looking at where are likenesses and representations that I see in my own life that relate to the people and images that I'm seeing from these different media. And so here's the installation that's currently up in thread that you can see. And within this particular installation, you have a combination of found photographs, cabinet cards, and there's multiple processes and techniques used in actually making the installation. There's additive processes, there's subtractive processes, there's hair that's incorporated, there's melanin that you can see kind of floating through when you see the melanin ghost through different images. And you also have different collage elements that are happening within the work as well as drawing. As I move on, we're looking at the work, the series Bell Jet, and you can see that installed. This is a install at the College of the Canyons, and you have a few pieces from that installation currently in thread. And with the Bell Jet series, I'm looking at portraiture and I'm looking at different representations of Blackness throughout time periods. And I thought a lot about the figure of Sarah Bartman. She has also been referred to as the Venus Hottentotten. And she was a woman who was shown in the World's Fair and put on exhibition. And even after she passed away, and this is her deceased body, her body was displayed and exotified. And so I thought it was important to think about this image and representation of Black femalehood and incorporate it into portraiture that's representing Black women across continents, across time, within the diaspora. And so you can see her incorporated within this beauty queen image from Jet Beauty of the Week imagery. I also use imagery from family photos. So these are actually my grandmother's. And I incorporate pastel pencils, powdered pigment, and I make collages digitally within the Bell Jet works, but I also go in and work with in hand using these different tools, as well as powdered pigment, spray paint, graphite, gouache, acrylic. And so when I'm pulling from these different sources and you see them combined within the works, they start to tell these multiple kind of stories about identity, where not only do I have a Jet Beauty of the Week, but I have my grandmother. Not only do I have Sarah Bartman, but I also have the Beauty of the Week or a portrait of one of my relatives that are included. This is a great example, and it's actually on view in the thread exhibition. She's All American. That was my grandfather. And this is my grandmother. So again, these family and personal histories becoming something that's a part of the work and being combined with popular culture and other historical moments to help create these different types of images and representations. And some of the imagery that you're seeing here is actually text that comes from the actual print from the Jet Beauty of the Week, where they may have a little bit of information about the character or the women that they have their portraits featured in. And for the composition of the work, you actually have, that's actually the back of a stereograph that's turned vertical. And that's why you have that kind of elongated composition throughout all of them. So I play not only with the format and design within the cabinet card, but also within the stereograph, and use those as design elements within the work. So you can see things like the stamp of the photographer for the stereograph consistently in the work, but then you will see hints of my signature within it, or then the marking of what lot this actually came from. So then there's not only a mixture of information that comes from imagery of women that I'm using, or men or family members, but of the actual archived image, where you have notations of how people are collecting or mediating the different archive of photographs, and then what happens by the time I get my hands onto it. So that's a little bit about the Bell, Jet, and cabinet card works. Were there questions? Did you have questions about those particular works, especially those in the exhibition, that you would like me to cover?
I mean, I guess I have a question.
Sure.
And I was wondering, I mean, it's kind of I guess it's sort of a two-part collection. Like, it seems like collecting must be a big part of making your work, like
Yes.
collecting the images, collecting the cabinet cards, collecting family photographs. And I guess I wonder if you feel like you are creating kind of your own history, if you're adding to an existing history, if you're just writing a completely different history, like that kind of relationship between collecting and creating these historical stories or presences with this work. How do you think about that relationship between history and collecting?
Totally. It's been so interesting because collecting, you're doing a lot of research. So part of it is about the research part of my practice, and building resources. And it is about looking at and starting to form or develop a perspective or history based on some of the different items that you're collecting. So for example, with the cabinet cards, finding representations of white people in cabinet cards, super easy, like dime a dozen. You start trying to find cabinet cards that represent non-white people, it's much harder to find. It's a different sourcing you have to do, and it can be really competitive. And some things, with the change of time, like magazines used to be abundant at a point in time. And it was something that it was like, oh my gosh, I have too much of this, I have to throw it away. Now you don't have people that have the same type of access to kind of the materiality of magazine or imagery in the same way. So the work then to go about collecting those now is something that's different. Then you also have other form, like what are the different forms that these kind of materials take? You have cabinet cards, you have printed magazines, you have photographs, you have slides. So that's like another source that I will look at and look for. Are there different slide representations? Because a lot of people don't have slides and it's an old technology. So you're almost tracking the different technologies that are used to produce imagery and creating a different archives of that and seeing how they're in conversation with each other, which is really interesting. Because once you go through all those kind of material, building that material archive, then you also have a digital archive as well. So there's there's a lot of information that you're taking on and organizing. But I agree with you in the sense of you are making these interventions into history and having these different conversations where you're incorporating people and perspectives that you may not have typically seen together or thought of as existing in the same time or space or being in dialogue. And I think that's something that's important about the work and the collecting of the archive and building of the archive is being able to have multiple figures in conversation and representing a multiplicity of identities within a singular body. So that idea of time and space, and you can see some in the work where you have imagery of space, you have the melanin, time and some figures are more solid than the others, this idea of kind of things becoming more clear and less clear. All of that is a part of the storytelling within the work. And kind of that reveal that you're saying of the different or simultaneous histories.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then also, if we had time, I'd be happy to share with you the public art projects I've been.
Yeah, I personally would love to see those. That would be great.
Okay. Let me just stop the share for a second.
I'd also be like the other thing I was thinking about with the cabinet cards and the layered images that are cut and torn, like your process with that, like how do you, they just seem, they layer so perfectly, and it's got to be a little scary cutting or tearing into them for the first time and
Yeah, I
figuring out if
mean,
it's really going to work or not or what.
totally. Like, you're working with cabinet cards, they're precious. It's like these materials, to a certain extent, like ripping them was a really big breakthrough for me personally, because I like really like them as objects. They're really beautiful. And it's like, in order to work with them, I had to kind of break away from the preciousness of them and really engage with them as objects and as art and feel free to do so. So some of in the process of ripping, there is a lot of like, hey, whatever works, you got to make it work, because there's only so much control I have over ripping like a 100+ year old paper material. So that I think that tension in and of itself is something that I think works both conceptually and formally within the work, and is something that I'm always kind of negotiating how that can work and developing kind of fun surprises as a result. So, and I'm not sure, are you able to see this video? That's
Yeah, I can see the video.
awesome.
Yep.
Okay, so this is from the COVID-19 Your Action Saves Lives public art project in Sacramento. And this is at Art and Fair Mall. And this is my second, excuse me, public art project. And something that I was really excited to do, in the sense of, one, we're still in COVID, and as an artist, you want to be able to engage in a meaningful way and participate in a meaningful way to kind of improve what our situation is and was, especially during that time when vaccines were still new, and there was still kind of uncertainty about masking and so on. And so as part of the campaign, one of my focuses was on promoting people wearing masks and using the mask as a space of storytelling about different activities and things that have happened during the pandemic or in the actual space. And it stems actually from an earlier project that I did, which I'll get to. Which is the Social Justice Billboard project. And this was done at George Floyd's memorial site. And again, I was thinking about what I was seeing on TV, what was going on with the social unrest during the pandemic. What was the mask? What were we living through while we're living in this time that we have to mask? And again, what is the story that the mask can tell? So for this particular project, I was incorporating different imagery that I was seeing from the news or online about social unrest, etc. And I thought it was really important that the figure is actually making direct eye contact with the viewers or the people in the environment. I thought a lot about kind of The Great Gatsby, where they talked about the billboard with the spectacles, in which it kind of was the all-knowing and seeing all. And I like the idea of both being a witness and a subject within a space, and that tension especially being important as part of a memorial site. So being able to do a project that addressed that site directly in a time period was something that was a really important breakthrough for me in my practice, but also a really great opportunity to have your work be discursive with a large audience as well. Here you're actually seeing the commercial that was produced for the Masking 2021 campaign, in which, again, different stories are being told within the body of the mask and encouraging people to wear their masks. So it's something that, again, the mask being something that speaks very much to our time period, and being representative of a space in which you can use it for storytelling in a marker of space. So, oops, let me get out of here real quick. So that was the commercial. And then, let me see here. And then in addition to the commercial, I also have the billboard that was located in Oak Park, Sacramento. And this is actually an image of my husband putting on his mask and wearing his mask. And I thought it was important to make it something that was very personal, that it's both me and my husband are actually incorporated into this work and into this series. So you saw me wearing the mask in the commercial and in the video work that was in the mall. But you also see my husband, he's incorporated in the mask, and he has imagery too, where you actually see him getting the COVID shot. So it's also looking at kind of modeling behavior to do during this time, as well as embedding kind of different stories and representation within the body of the mask. Another part of it too that I thought was really important, as well, is that you're seeing so much Black death to the point that I feel like it was being something that was being fetishized. So I really also thought it was important to show a Black man very present and alive and healthy. And I think that it was an important to have different representations other than the trauma, and to give ourselves something to look forward to besides constantly processing trauma. And so those are the public projects that I have recently done between now 2020 and now. And I do look forward to doing more public art projects. And it's been a real breakthrough in the sense of thinking about collage and video, and being able to work in these different mediums and continuing the conversation of the history of photography.
Cool, thank you. We have a question about synesthesia. Can you talk more about how synesthesia is incorporated into your work and what your experience is with it?
Yeah, so let me give you more examples. And actually, you'll be able to see this from my homepage, from the start of my talk with the cover page. Give me just 1 second. Okay, so in this image here, I actually start breaking up the tears and start incorporating these kind of sculptural colored elements within the work. And so I do have more cabinet cards in which I start breaking up the different, the picture plane, and incorporating these different kind of these different colored elements as a means of kind of abstracting and breaking up the picture plane, but also representing the synesthesia. I personally do not have that condition, but I do think it's an interesting concept in the sense of how it can aesthetically relate to the ideas of how we perceive time and perceive and experience time, and using that as a device within the work. It's a little blurry from this image, but you have space. This is a image of the Milky Way in back of this. So that breaking of space, literal space and kind of time is being, space and time are kind of literally being represented formally within the imagery of the work. But that's just a image with it. I have more cabinet cards with that, and you can check that out on my Instagram. If you go to jessica.wimbley on Instagram, you can see more of those cabinet cards.
Oh, thank you. And I'll post a link to your website in the chat for everyone. And are there any other last questions for Jessica? Thank you so much for sharing your work. This was great and so generous of you to spend your time with us. We really, really enjoyed getting to see see your work and hear more about your process and your collections. And I thought it was really helpful, especially at the beginning, to see the different writers and authors that have contributed to your thinking. I thought that was really a great background to have when thinking about your work. So
Thank you
that
so
was
much.
terrific. Yeah. So what are you reading right now?
So let's see. I'm like sitting here looking over at my book cart. There's some books that I'm waiting on to come in, but then I picked up some new catalogs on video art, and I went to the video show at MoCA in Los Angeles with sorry, clicking on her name, Pipoloti Wrist.
Oh, yeah.
Which was amazing, especially working in doing video and doing installation for public art. Seeing her video installation like rocked my world, and was totally inspiring. I definitely recommend people to go check that out. And then the first 50 years of video art. And then I've been nerding out. We got this book, Chromatopia, and it's an illustrated history of color. So it talks about, just the history of color and different pigments. Where did they come from? How are they used? Any kind of symbolism that's involved with them. So some nerd stuff. And Elma, I want to say Thomas, but I feel like that's wrong. Pretty sure it's wrong. No, Emma Amos. Sorry. I'm like, that's somebody I went to grad school with. But she's also been somebody who's been really interesting, whose work in painting and printmaking and the figure and how she's using color, I think has been really interesting. So I literally have a book cart right now that's right next to me that has a bunch of different exhibition catalogs, different books that I like to flip through and go through and nerd out. So I keep building that collection, but when I start nerding out on kind of like the academic reading, I have to balance that with like some fun reading. It helps me process it a little easier, or fun storytelling that helps me kind of process. So I also love listening to LeVar Burton reads. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of LeVar Burton's podcast, but if you're into sci-fi, you like reading Rainbow, and you love LeVar Burton, and you also love Star Trek, because I love Star Trek too, then that's right up your alley, because he reads basically his favorite like sci-fi and stories to you. So it's very soothing. So I enjoy balancing some of that out with some good old, podcasts, or some great like I've been watching Foundation on Apple TV. That's been one of my fun sci-fi guilty pleasures. So there's a bunch of different media that I like to kind of consume that inspires me, or gives me a break, or allows me to nerd out and be at peace.
Cool. Another book related question. This is from Natalia, who you met at the career chat. Was that last week, I think? Which work of Octavia Butler's is your favorite? Which has had the most influence on your art practice?
Oh gosh, that's hard. I mean, the whole Wild Seed series has been really impactful, in the sense of like a Black female who is essentially immortal and can shapeshift and shifts through identities, which I thought was really good. Octavia's, I feel like her sci-fi, where she goes back in time to slavery, is one that a lot of people have you read first, but I think it's her least interesting sci-fi. She also has a book of short stories that I really recommend that are pretty interesting. Um, she's rather prophetic. So Parable of the Sours, Parable of the Talents, you hear a lot about now. And partly because she was like really prophetic, where essentially you have a character, Black female character, who creates a new religion, which is based off of change. So she was like, God is change. And this was like pre-Barack Obama. Um, and so that was really interesting. So I definitely suggest the Wild Seed series, and going into like Pattern Master. Parable of the Towers, Parable of the Talents, like save for last. Um, and she also has a vampire one, but it's like her last book. So you're left kind of hurting because there's no more. And it starts off as a really good story. So yeah, I was introduced to Octavia Butler when I was in grad school, and I was fortunate enough to meet her when she was still alive, and get her to sign a couple of books. So she was super influential. And a bunch of scientists actually introduced me to her because I was looking at like Henrietta Lacks and thinking about the Black female body and science and so on.
Thank you. That's great. My daughter has read a couple of her books, and I'll definitely pass those recommendations on to her because she really liked them. So that's great. If there are any last questions, I saw at one point that someone had their hand up, but I didn't get to it quickly enough. So I apologize for that. If you do want to type something quick in the chat, we can maybe take one more question. But otherwise, Jessica, I really want to thank you again for joining us today. And thank you for sharing your work. And I hope everyone has a chance to visit the gallery and see the work in person. So thank you.
Thank you so much.